fire roared beneath the iron cauldron, its flames licking upward, hungrily devouring the wood piled high by the soldiers of Rome. The liquid inside seethed and bubbled, spitting steam into the air like some living beast. The smell of smoke and hot metal stung the nostrils of the crowd that had gathered. Men and women pressed shoulder to shoulder in the square, their faces caught somewhere between fascination and dread. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, merchants craned their necks for a better view, and old men muttered prayers to gods they half believed in. They were not here for a festival, nor a triumphal procession, nor the gladiatorial spectacle of beasts and blood. No, they were here for something darker. They were here to watch a man die. Dragged forward by guards in bronze helmets, chains rattling around his wrists and ankles, was a figure who looked nothing like a criminal. His robes were simple, his body frail, his beard unkempt from imprisonment, but his eyes were alive, sharp, burning with mockery, even as the soldiers shoved him toward the boiling pot. This was Heraclitus of Abdera, a philosopher whose words had angered priests, governors, and magistrates alike. He had no army, no throne, no riches. What he possessed was far more dangerous, a tongue that refused silence and a mind that refused obedience. The sentence was death, not by sword, not by crucifixion, not even by the jaws of beasts. No, his punishment would be stranger and more terrible. He would be lowered into boiling liquid, cooked alive for the eyes of the public. It was meant to be a lesson in fear, a warning carved into memory. But what the rulers had not anticipated was how their victim would meet his fate. For as the chains tightened and the iron hook began lowering him into the bubbling cauldron, Heraclitus did not cry out. He did not beg, nor curse, nor fall silent in resignation. Instead, he laughed. At first it was only a chuckle, low and unsettling. Then it grew louder, sharper, spilling out into the square in peals of wild laughter. His voice cut through the roar of fire, rising above the bubbling liquid. The sound was not the hysteria of a broken man. It was the mocking cackle of one who saw through the charade of power, one who ridiculed pain itself. To the magistrates, it was unbearable. To the crowd, it was unforgettable. This was no ordinary execution. This was a philosopher's final lesson, delivered not in words, but in defiance. He was teaching that even as flesh burned and life dissolved, the human spirit could spit in the face of tyranny. The authorities had intended to destroy him, but in the act of dying, he turned their cruelty into a grotesque theatre of resistance. The year was sometime in the 2nd century CE, at the height of Rome's dominion. The empire stretched from Britain's cold frontiers to the deserts of Arabia, from the Rhine's forests to the sands of Africa. It was a machine of conquest, law, and spectacle, a world in which emperors were gods, cities bustled with wealth, and blood was currency for entertainment. But beneath the marble temples and triumphal arches, fear was the mortar that held the empire together. Public executions were not justice, they were reminders. They whispered to every onlooker, "This is what happens when you defy Rome." And yet, here was a man who shattered that illusion. Heraclitus had no weapons, no allies, no escape. What he had was laughter, the most dangerous response of all, for laughter turned their cruelty into absurdity. Laughter stripped the executioners of their dignity. Laughter showed the people that fear could be mocked. In that moment, a simple philosopher became something far more dangerous than a rebel. He became a symbol. But why was this man condemned in such a grotesque fashion? Why did officials choose boiling, a punishment as theatrical as it was rare? And what truths did Heraclitus speak that frightened the powerful enough to demand his destruction? As the smoke rose and the crowd recoiled, whispers spread through the square. Some said the philosopher had lost his mind, that he laughed because madness carried him beyond the reach of pain. Others swore it was divine power, that the gods themselves had placed defiance in his lungs. And some, quietly, dangerously, believed that he was right, that Rome's cruelty could be laughed at and therefore undone. This was no ordinary death. This was no ordinary man. This was Heraclitus of Abdera, the philosopher who laughed while boiling, and his story was only the beginning. To understand why a man like Heraclitus was condemned to such an unthinkable fate, we must first step back and examine the world in which he lived. A world where power was never secure, where rulers leaned on cruelty as their strongest pillar, and where fear was the invisible chain binding millions to obedience. The Roman Empire of the 2nd century CE was at the height of its glory. Its borders stretched across 3 continents, its legions were unmatched, and its emperors sat upon thrones draped in the illusion of divine authority. But absolute power, as history shows us again and again, breeds absolute paranoia. Behind the marble facades of temples and amphitheaters, the empire's true foundations rested not on justice or virtue, but on terror. In this world, punishment was not simply about silencing dissenters. It was a theater of control. The cross, the arena, the pyre, the boiling pot, all of these were props in Rome's grand performance. The empire understood something chillingly simple. People fear what they can see. A crucifixion on the roadside, the screams of a prisoner torn apart by beasts, the stench of burning flesh drifting through city streets. These were messages carved not in ink, but in blood and ash, and every citizen who watched was meant to remember, Rome is merciless and Rome is eternal. Philosophers were a peculiar threat to this order. They did not raise armies, they did not conspire in secret plots, and they did not seize fortresses. Instead, they attacked something far more fragile, the illusion of power itself. With words, they could strip the mask off emperors and governors, exposing the nakedness of their cruelty. With satire, they could turn sacred rites into ridicule. With arguments, they could plant seeds of doubt in the minds of listeners, whispering that the empire was not eternal, nor divine, nor just. Heraclitus of Abdera was one such man. He was no revolutionary general, no conspirator armed with daggers in the Senate. He was a thinker, and that made him far more dangerous. Reports suggest he mocked the rituals of the gods, laughed at the pomp of priests, and derided the hypocrisy of officials who preached virtue while drowning themselves in luxury and vice. In an empire obsessed with appearances, this kind of ridicule was poison, and so fear became the answer. To silence him, they did not choose exile or a quiet dagger in the night. They chose boiling, an execution as rare as it was terrifying. Why? Because it was unforgettable. To lower a man into a cauldron before the eyes of a crowd was to transform his death into a ritual of submission. It was not just about killing Heraclitus. It was about reminding the people that their laughter, their doubts, their criticisms could also be dragged into the square and drowned in fire. But what Rome could not anticipate was that Heraclitus would not play the role they had written for him. He was meant to scream, to beg, to writhe in terror. Instead, he laughed. That laughter was a rupture in the script, a shattering of the empire's control. For if a man could laugh at boiling, then what else could be laughed at? Could the emperor be mocked? Could the legions be mocked? Could the empire itself be reduced to absurdity? This is the paradox of fear as a weapon. The more cruel and theatrical it becomes, the more it risks unraveling itself. When cruelty fails to terrify, when it inspires awe or courage or even ridicule, it ceases to serve its masters. In Heraclitus's death, power overreached. The boiling was meant to crush philosophy, but it instead immortalized it. For the rulers, however, paranoia never rested. Every satirical whisper, every muttered joke in a tavern, every philosopher gathering students beneath the colonnades, it all became a threat. Heraclitus's execution was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was part of a long tradition of silencing. Dissent, Socrates forced to drink hemlock, Seneca ordered to open his veins, Christians burned in Nero's gardens. Rome's leaders feared the pen and the tongue almost as much as the sword, and so they ruled with a theatre of pain. A theatre where control was written in screams. A theatre where paranoia became law. And in the middle of this vast machinery of fear stood a frail man from Abdera, who would not stop laughing even as the empire tried to boil him alive. The day of Heraclitus's execution dawned like any other in the Roman province. The markets opened, merchants shouted their prices, and farmers brought their goods to sell. Yet word had already spread through the streets. Today, there would be a spectacle. Today, a philosopher who mocked the gods and insulted the rulers would face his punishment. By mid-morning, the square was packed, its air heavy with the mixture of excitement and dread that only public death could conjure. At the center stood the cauldron, enormous, blackened from years of use in the barracks. It had been filled to the brim with water and oil. Beneath it, a roaring fire sent tongues of flame snapping around the iron belly. Steam hissed and writhed like serpents above its surface, forming a curtain that blurred the outlines of the soldiers guarding it. To the people pressed close, the sight was both mesmerizing and sickening. Then came the condemned. Shackled at the wrists, his robe dirtied by weeks in a cell, Heraclitus of Abdera was dragged into the square. He did not fight the soldiers who pushed him forward, nor did he stumble in despair. He walked with the deliberate steps of a man approaching a stage. His face bore not the terror expected of a man about to be boiled alive, but a peculiar calm, eyes gleaming, lips curled in something dangerously close to amusement. The magistrates read the charges aloud: impiety, treason of the tongue, corruption of the people through dangerous words. Each accusation carried weight, but Heraclitus remained unmoved. When asked for his last words, he lifted his head toward the crowd. "Behold," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the smoke, "the wisdom of rulers who fear laughter more than steel." Murmurs rippled through the spectators. Some shifted uneasily, others smirked nervously, but the magistrates scowled. They had expected pleading, perhaps curses, anything, but this brazen defiance. With a signal of the hand, the guards moved him toward the cauldron. Chains clinked as the philosopher was hoisted onto a crude wooden frame. Slowly, the mechanism began to lower him. The first touch of heat seared his skin, turning it red in an instant. The crowd winced instinctively, waiting for the inevitable scream. But what came instead froze the square. A laugh, low at first, almost a chuckle, then growing louder, sharper, cutting through the roar of the fire. Heraclitus laughed. His body trembled as the boiling liquid licked at his feet, yet from his mouth came peals of mocking laughter. The sound was so wrong, so unnatural, that even the guards hesitated. The magistrates barked the order: lower him further. As the liquid rose to his knees, the flesh blistered and split, releasing the stench of cooked skin. The crowd recoiled, some covering their noses, others gagging. Still, Heraclitus laughed. His eyes burned with defiance, his laughter echoing like a weapon hurled at the very men who condemned him. Children cried, old men whispered that he was possessed, that no mortal could laugh in such agony. Some claimed he was mocking the gods themselves, and others quietly dared to believe that he was proving something, that power itself could be ridiculed, even as it killed. The soldiers, unnerved, hesitated once more, but the magistrates, their pride stung, commanded the execution to continue. The philosopher was lowered further, steam engulfing him, his body twisting under the assault of heat. His laughter grew hoarse, but it did not stop. Even as blisters erupted across his chest, even as his skin sloughed from his arms, he laughed. Each sound an insult, each cackle a dagger thrown into the pride of Rome. Finally, his voice faltered. The laughter turned ragged, broken by the hiss of steam and the crackle of fire. Yet still, until the very end, he forced sound from his lungs. Not screams, not pleas, but laughter. A final refusal to grant his executioners the satisfaction of fear. When at last the frame was lifted, what remained was a grotesque ruin of flesh. The crowd was silent, stunned not by the cruelty of Rome. Cruelty was nothing new, but by the way their victim had met it. In that silence, the magistrates realized something dreadful. The philosopher had won. They had sought to terrify the people with an unforgettable death. Instead, they had etched into memory the image of a man who mocked pain and power itself. The boiling had killed Heraclitus, but his laughter lingered like smoke in the minds of all who heard it. And as the crowd dispersed, whispers spread faster than the flames that had consumed him. The philosopher laughed while boiling. Some said he was mad, some said he was blessed, but all agreed they would never forget. Behind every public execution in Rome lay a private drama, hidden motives, whispered betrayals, and the carefully constructed lies of those in power. To the ordinary citizens crammed into the square, Heraclitus's boiling was the punishment of a blasphemer. To the magistrates who ordered it, it was a calculated act of control. But to those who knew the corridors of power, it was something far more sinister, the silencing of a voice that had seen too much and spoken far too loudly. Officially, Heraclitus was executed for impiety and for corrupting the minds of the people with dangerous speech. The charge of impiety was Rome's blunt instrument, wielded whenever rulers needed to eliminate a troublesome thinker. It was the same blade that had cut down Socrates centuries before, dressed up as justice, but, in truth, nothing more than fear wearing a mask. What had Heraclitus done? Some accounts claim he mocked the sacrifices offered to the gods, calling them empty rituals designed not to honor divinity, but to line the pockets of priests. Others say he ridiculed the governor himself, accusing him of greed, hypocrisy, and cowardice. In a society built on appearances, where the authority of both gods and governors depended on reverence, such words were fire. Left unchecked, they could spread. Heraclitus had long been a thorn in the side of the provincial elites. He was not a man of wealth or noble blood, but he possessed the one power Rome's aristocrats most feared: influence over minds. He gathered students in porticos and marketplaces, men and women alike, who listened to his sharp wit and biting criticisms. The more he laughed at corruption, the more others began to laugh with him, and laughter, in a world built on fear, was intolerable. Sources suggest that priests, embarrassed by his open mockery of sacrifices, lobbied the governor for his arrest. But the priests were not the only ones with motives. Wealthy landowners, who controlled the province's economy, feared his criticism of exploitation. Even within the governor's own circle, jealous rivals whispered that allowing a philosopher to insult Rome without consequence was a sign of weakness. Slowly, quietly, the pressure mounted until the governor decided Heraclitus had to die. But why boiling? Why not the sword or the cross? Here the shadows of intrigue grow darker. A simple execution would have ended Heraclitus's life, but it would not have silenced his voice. His followers might have carried on his teachings, turning him into a martyr. To strip him of dignity, to transform him from a respected philosopher into a grotesque spectacle, they needed something theatrical. Boiling was humiliation by fire, and steam, a punishment reserved for heretics, poisoners, and the most despised criminals. By condemning Heraclitus to this death, his enemies sought to brand him not as a thinker, but as a monster. It was political theatre at its cruelest. In Said, the weeks before his execution, court whispers revealed the tension beneath the decision. Some advisors feared that such a spectacular punishment would backfire, that the philosopher's defiance might inspire sympathy. Others argued that anything less than total annihilation would look like weakness. The governor himself, paranoid about appearing soft, chose severity. Still, in the private chambers of power, unease lingered. One magistrate reportedly remarked, "If he laughs at death, we shall all look like fools." It was a warning, unheeded, yet prophetic. The priests played their part, proclaiming that the gods demanded punishment for impiety. They blessed the cauldron, turning an execution into a ritual sacrifice. To the people, it was presented as divine justice. But to many, the spectacle rang hollow. If the gods were truly offended, why did Heraclitus laugh as he died? Did his laughter not mock the gods as much as the rulers? And if the gods were powerless to silence him, what did that say about the men who spoke in their name? The irony was sharp. The governor and priests claimed to defend order and piety, yet their actions reeked of fear and corruption. Heraclitus had accused them of hypocrisy, and in the very act of executing him, they proved him right. Their cruelty did not erase his words. It validated them. Even among his students and sympathizers, betrayal loomed. Some abandoned him out of fear, refusing to speak his name after his death. Others whispered his story in secret, ensuring it would survive despite the authorities' efforts. The court, for all its power, could not prevent the spread of rumor and memory. And in those memories, the laughter of Heraclitus grew louder, more haunting. For the magistrates and priests, there was no triumph in his death. Instead of quelling dissent, the executions sparked unease. Their enemies whispered that they had been humiliated by a dying man. Their allies doubted the wisdom of boiling a philosopher alive. And the governor himself, far from silencing criticism, found his name tied forever to an act of grotesque cruelty. Heraclitus was dead, but the court that killed him lived on under a shadow of ridicule. His laughter did not fade with the smoke. It echoed in the chambers of power, a reminder that even the mightiest rulers could be mocked by a frail, chained man. When the fires died down and the cauldron was emptied, Heraclitus's body was gone. But his laughter remained. It clung to the air like smoke, seeping into the memories of every witness. And from those memories, a new struggle began. How would society make sense of a philosopher who laughed while boiling alive? Among the commoners, his death became a tale whispered in taverns and marketplaces. Some repeated it with awe. He laughed in the face of death. For the poor and powerless, who lived daily under the lash of taxes and the threat of punishment, his defiance offered a spark of courage. If a man could mock Rome at the very moment of destruction, perhaps the empire was not as invincible as it seemed. Mothers frightened their children into obedience with warnings. Do not mock the gods, lest you end like Heraclitus in the pot. Yet those same children grew up hearing older brothers and fathers retell the story with admiration. The spectacle, intended to inspire fear instead, sowed confusion. Half cautionary tale, half legend of resistance. For the ruling class, the laughter of Heraclitus was more dangerous than his philosophy. His execution was supposed to demonstrate control, but instead it exposed vulnerability. At dinner parties and in marble villas, elites spoke of him not as a criminal, but as a troubling enigma. Some dismissed him as insane, insisting no sane man could laugh through boiling. Others quietly admitted they envied his courage, for they knew they themselves would have screamed. And yet, few dared to speak openly. To praise Heraclitus was to question the wisdom of the governor, and to question the governor was to risk one's own safety. So the elites cloaked their unease in silence, letting the common people shape the legend. The priests faced the most difficult task of all, explaining why the gods had allowed such laughter. They had blessed the cauldron, proclaimed divine justice, and invoked the wrath of heaven. Yet before the eyes of all, Heraclitus had ridiculed their authority. His laughter rang like a mockery not only of Rome, but of Jupiter himself. Some priests doubled down, declaring that the laughter was proof of possession, that demons had filled Heraclitus with madness. Others claimed it was the last trick of a condemned man, a hollow mask hiding unbearable pain. But the people, watching and remembering, were not convinced. The laughter had been too real, too unyielding. In trying to destroy a blasphemer, the priests had stumbled into blasphemy themselves. Stories diverged. To some, Heraclitus became a cautionary tale of arrogance, the man who mocked the gods and was boiled for it. To others, he was a symbol of freedom, proof that cruelty could be laughed at. Both versions spread, carried by travelers from province to province, mutating with each retelling. In time, the tale crossed cultural boundaries. Among some early Christians, it was retold as an example of pagan cruelty and the endurance of the human spirit under torture. Among philosophers, it became a parable about the triumph of the mind over the body. For cynics and satirists, Heraclitus's laughter was the ultimate joke, one last insult hurled at tyranny. But perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. Every person who had stood in that square carried away not only the memory of boiling flesh, but the sound of defiance. That sound made cruelty less predictable. If even death could be mocked, what power did Rome truly hold? Fear still ruled the streets, but it no longer felt absolute. Somewhere in the back of every mind lingered the thought, what if laughter is stronger than fear? Ironically, the authorities' choice of execution method may have changed the culture of punishment itself. In later records, boiling appears less frequently, as though officials feared repeating the disaster of Heraclitus's laughter. The empire thrived on control, but the philosopher had revealed that some punishments could backfire, turning victims into legends. In the end, Heraclitus of Abdera achieved in death what he had pursued in life. He forced society to confront its hypocrisies. The poor found courage in him, the rich found unease, and the priests found themselves mocked by the very man they condemned. His execution was meant to erase him. Instead, it magnified his voice until it echoed across classes, faiths, and generations. The empire wanted him forgotten, but the people remembered. They remembered the boiling pot, the steam rising into the air, and above it all, the laughter. Every spectacle has a purpose. Rome's executions were not mere punishments. They were messages, warnings written in flesh and fire. When Heraclitus of Abdera was condemned to the cauldron, the authorities believed they were sending the clearest message of all. Mock the empire, and the empire will boil the laughter out of you. But the message twisted. Instead of reinforcing fear, the execution unraveled it. Instead of silencing a philosopher, it gave birth to a legend. This was the moment where cruelty overreached, where the machinery of terror cracked, and where the laughter of a dying man threatened to outlive the empire itself. In most executions, the crowd played its role, gasping, jeering, cheering, reinforcing the lesson of Rome. But when Heraclitus laughed, the people did not jeer. They fell into stunned silence. They were supposed to feel fear. Instead, many felt something dangerously close to admiration. Some even whispered that his laughter mocked not only the magistrates, but the gods themselves. The silence of the crowd was the first turning point. The executioners had expected to hear the philosopher's screams echo through the square. Instead, they heard laughter, and then their own powerlessness reflected in the uneasy hush of thousands. Fear had not been sown, doubt had. For the governor and magistrates, this was a disaster. They had gambled on boiling precisely because of its theatricality. But theatre works both ways. It can elevate the victim as easily as it can humiliate him. Heraclitus's laughter turned the entire execution into a grotesque parody of justice, where the condemned mocked the rulers, even in death. Behind closed doors, panic set in. Some officials muttered that the execution had been a mistake. Others feared that philosophers elsewhere would seize on the story, using it to attack Roman authority. Even priests felt their position shaken. How could they claim the gods had demanded this punishment when the victim seemed untouchable by divine terror? In the taverns and alleys, the story spread faster than fire. Within days, travelers carried it into neighboring towns, the tale of the philosopher who laughed while boiling. Each retelling grew darker, sharper. Some said he never stopped laughing until the very moment his body was gone. Others claimed his laughter was so powerful it extinguished the fire beneath the cauldron. Fact blurred with legend, but the message remained the same. Cruelty had failed. For Rome, this was the true danger. Not one man's defiance, but the possibility that his defiance might ignite others. If laughter could turn death into resistance, what else might it inspire? Ordinary citizens, long accustomed to bowing their heads before soldiers and priests, began to view punishment differently. No longer was it the unassailable proof of Rome's dominance. Now it was a gamble, a risk that cruelty might not terrify, but inspire. The laughter of Heraclitus had shifted the balance of power in the most dangerous way, in the minds of the people. Even those who feared him could not erase the image. Parents warned their children not to defy authority, but the children whispered about him anyway. Workers retold his story while laboring on roads and aqueducts. His laughter became a ghost in the empire's vast machinery of control, an echo, reminding everyone that fear was not absolute. For rulers who thrived on paranoia, this was intolerable. Every philosopher became a potential Heraclitus. Every critic's smile was a reminder of laughter in the square. Executions continued, of course. Rome's machine of cruelty could not simply stop, but the memory of that one spectacle haunted them. Each time they condemned a dissenter, they feared that the victim might again turn agony into mockery, that the theater of control might collapse into humiliation. In this way, Heraclitus's laughter became more than a sound. It became a weapon, a curse lingering in the imagination of Rome's elites. They had wanted to terrify the people. Instead, they terrified themselves. The authorities thought that lowering a philosopher into boiling liquid would destroy both the man and his message. But it was in that very act that they ensured his immortality. His laughter was the hinge, the turning point where cruelty became weakness, where fear turned against its master. Rome could crucify, burn, and boil as many as it wished, but it could not unmake the memory of Heraclitus. His defiance had shown a terrible truth. There are limits to power. There are moments when cruelty ceases to command respect and instead inspires rebellion, whether open or silent, in deeds or in whispers. For Heraclitus, death was the end. For Rome, it was the beginning of a haunting that would not fade. In later years, chroniclers recorded the story not as a tale of justice, but as a cautionary warning to rulers: do not push cruelty too far, lest it turn against you. The boiling of Heraclitus became one of those moments in history when a single act of brutality failed to break its victim, and instead broke the illusion of power itself. His body was destroyed, but his laughter lived on. And in that laughter lay the most dangerous truth of all: that fear can be mocked. And when it is mocked, it begins to die. The death of Heraclitus did not vanish into the smoke of that cauldron. Long after the fire was extinguished and the body disposed of, his execution lingered in memory, festering like an unhealed wound in the conscience of Rome. Officials had hoped the boiling would be remembered as proof of their power, but it was remembered instead as proof of their cruelty, and more dangerously, proof that cruelty could be mocked. Chroniclers could not resist the story. Writers like Lucian of Samosata repeated the account, shaping it into a grotesque parable. Some framed Heraclitus as a madman, consumed by folly, laughing not out of strength, but out of insanity. Yet even in their efforts to diminish him, they preserved him. His name appeared in their texts, his laughter echoing centuries after his death, turning what should have been a silenced voice into an immortal whisper. Others, less hostile, told his story with a kind of grim admiration, seeing in him the embodiment of a philosopher's creed, that the mind could rise above pain, that spirit could triumph even as flesh was destroyed. Among later generations, his death became a mirror in which societies saw what they wished to see. For satirists, he was the ultimate cynic, a man who ridiculed not only the governors of Rome, but life itself. For moralists, he was a warning of arrogance, a fool who dared mock the gods and paid the price. For Christians, he became a symbol, proof that pagan cruelty was monstrous, and that true endurance of suffering lay not in the amphitheater, but in defiance of worldly powers. In every retelling, the cauldron boiled again, and the philosopher laughed anew. What haunted rulers most was the lesson his death carried for those who came after. Fear, they realized, was not indestructible. They could crucify thousands, feed rebels to beasts, and line the roads with corpses. But all it took was one man laughing at their terror to unravel the illusion. Cruelty works only so long as victims play their part. When the victim refuses, when he mocks, resists, or embraces death with a smile, the execution ceases to be a warning and becomes a humiliation. Heraclitus's laughter stripped away the dignity of authority, the magistrates in their robes, the priests in their finery, the soldiers with their spears. All were reduced to actors in a farce, while the condemned man became the playwright. The legacy was corrosive. In later centuries, when rulers considered theatrical punishments, they remembered the disaster of Abdera. They remembered how a man meant to be destroyed had instead been elevated, how his laughter had unsettled the very people it was supposed to terrify. Cruelty remained, of course. Rome never abandoned its spectacles, but there was always the fear, buried deep in the minds of governors and emperors, that another Heraclitus might rise and turn the theatre against them. His story traveled across borders and ages. In medieval chronicles, the tale appeared as a fragment, retold as a warning about the dangers of unchecked mockery, or as a celebration of courage under torture. In the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered it with fascination, debating whether it was myth or history, allegory or truth. But regardless of the judgment, they repeated it, ensuring that the philosopher who laughed while boiling would never be forgotten. What endures is not the factual certainty of the event. Historians will forever question whether he truly laughed, whether the cauldron boiled as described, or whether the entire scene was exaggerated for effect. What endures is the image. A man chained, lowered into bubbling liquid, refusing to give his executioners the satisfaction of fear, filling the square with laughter until his body gave out. That image is stronger than fact. It is stronger than time. And so Heraclitus's legacy is not simply that of a philosopher killed for impiety, nor even of a man who mocked his rulers. His legacy is a reminder of the fragility of power, of the moment when cruelty ceases to terrify and begins to unravel itself. His laughter is the ghost Rome could not silence. It is the echo of defiance that outlived the empire that sought to destroy it. The image is inescapable. The cauldron hissing, the fire roaring, the crowd holding its breath. And above it all, the sound no one expected, the sound that turned agony into defiance, punishment into legend, laughter. Heraclitus of Abdera died not as a broken man, but as a mocking echo in the face of power. His execution was supposed to be a warning, but in time it became a question that still haunts history. How much of power is real, and how much is illusion? Rome believed cruelty could secure obedience, that boiling a philosopher alive would erase his influence. But his laughter revealed the truth. The body can be destroyed, yet spirit, courage, and mockery can outlive the flames. The story traveled through centuries, reshaped with each retelling. Was it madness? Was it bravery? Was it a philosopher's ultimate lesson that pain itself can be ridiculed? Historians still debate, yet perhaps the truth lies not in the details, but in the haunting effect of the tale. We remember him not because of how he died, but because of how he refused to die in the way his executioners demanded, and so the story becomes modern. For every age has its tyrants, its rulers who believe that fear is unshakable, that cruelty will always silence dissent. But the laughter of Heraclitus whispers otherwise. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments, power is fragile, and that defiance, whether in word, in act, or in something as strange as laughter, can pierce the armor of tyranny. Perhaps he did not laugh as loudly as the stories claim. Perhaps the tale was embroidered by writers who loved grotesque irony. But in the end, the facts matter less than the memory. The image of a man boiling alive, mocking his killers with laughter, is more than history. It is myth, it is a weapon, and it is a warning. So ask yourself, had you been in that crowd, standing shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors as the steam rose? What would you have heard in that laughter? Madness, courage, or the crumbling of power itself? Because one truth, remains. Long after Rome fell, the fire burned out, and the cauldron turned cold. The laughter of Heraclitus was still echoing.